Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History of Podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Frank Hughes. And today we're going to be discussing the pastoral epistles 1, 2 Timothy, and Titus, and why they are not by the historical Paul the Apostle. So, Frank, thank you for joining me today.
My great pleasure. I hope that the weather is going to hold out, and we're having a severe thunderstorm, so hopefully our signal will be good.
Yeah, let's hope so. Let's go ahead and start with the presentation.
Well, the New Testament is a collection of collections of literature. And actually, if Bob Jewett and I are correct about Corinthians, it's a collection of collections of collections. In other words, the Corinthian correspondence is a collection, which is part of the collection known as the Pauline corpus, is part of the collection known as the New Testament. And so the earliest collection is the Pauline corpus. The Pauline corpus also includes the letter to the Hebrews, which we call it that because part of the time the church said that Paul wrote it. Origen in the early 3rd century knew that he didn't write it. He says, in truth, who wrote the epistle, only God knows. And so nonetheless, Hebrews was in with the other letters of the Pauline corpus in the manuscript tradition. So the manuscript traditions are really the Gospels, and then the Pauline corpus, and then the Acts and the Catholic epistles. Sometimes the Catholic epistles were first, and then the book of Revelation had a separate manuscript tradition. So the earliest collection in the New Testament, as far as we know or believe, is the Pauline corpus. And when Paul wrote his letters, the Gospels were not, had not been written as far as we have evidence. So let's go on to the next. We use the term Pauline corpus. It's a neutral term. We're not saying whether Paul wrote the letters or not, but it's the body of literature in which the Pauline letters, as well as other letters, such as letters that are attributed to Paul, but are probably not by Paul, they also are part of the Pauline corpus. And the questions of which of the letters of the Pauline corpus were actually not written by Paul has been intensely debated for 9 decades now. And I wrote a dissertation called Early Christian Rhetoric and 2 Thessalonians, and that was published in January of 1989. And I argued that Paul didn't write 2 Thessalonians, and my teacher, Robert Jewett, disagreed with it. So there's a lot of room for disagreement in the question of the authorship of Pauline letters. Let's go on. The texts that we are talking about that are called the pastoral epistles or the pastoral letters are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And so with the exception of the letter to the Hebrews, the 3 pastoral letters are the letters that are most strongly thought of by most scholars as not having been written by Paul. And so there is a majority view and there is the minority view. And so Hebrews does not claim to be by Paul. It's anonymous, and form critically speaking, it is not actually a letter. So let's go on. I can tell you that in terms of Pauline theology and our reconstruction of what went on during the lifetime of Paul, it matters very greatly which letters that Paul wrote. If you are asking historical questions, then you need to know, or you need to try to know, what Paul was doing, and that included his travels, and that included his letter writing. And so if you change your view about which letters of the Pauline corpus Paul wrote or dictated, then that actually changes your view of Pauline theology as a whole. Let's go on. Here is a listing of the Pauline corpus, and I put the pastoral letters or the pastoral epistles in red. And you can see the authentic letters are in order of length, are Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. And then the three Deutero-Pauline letters, as they are usually called, are Colossians, Ephesians, and 2 Thessalonians. By the way, the writer of Ephesians probably had a copy of Colossians, and the writer of 2 Thessalonians assuredly had a copy of 1 Thessalonians. The writer of Colossians may have had a copy of Philippians. So Edgar Goodspeed, in his book, The Meaning of Ephesians, in the 30s, argued that the writer of Ephesians wrote Ephesians as kind of a general or encyclical letter, and that the writer of Ephesians had a copy not only of Colossians, but virtually all the other Pauline letters. And that latter part of what he said is his Goodspeed's Ephesian hypothesis did not find an extremely high number of people who agreed with him. But Edgar Goodspeed taught at the University of Chicago and was one of the most influential New Testament scholars in his time in the United States, and he had a great deal of influence in Germany too. Let's go on. First Timothy and Titus are very similar to us, very similar to each other, in that their primary concern is church order. And you have essentially job descriptions or descriptions of what kind of people ought to be made as bishops, and what kind of people ought to be presbyters, and what kind of people ought to be deacons, and in 1 Timothy, what kind of women ought to be widows and therefore put on the church payroll. Now, 2 Timothy does not appear to be interested in church order. It appears to present itself as a letter by Paul, who believes that he is going to die real soon. And it reads, to a great extent, like a last will and testament. And there are one or two scholars, such as Jerry Murphy O'Connor, the late Jerome Murphy O'Connor, who believed that Paul did not write 1 Timothy and Titus, but that Paul did write 2 Timothy. So 2 Timothy is kind of different, quite different from 1 Timothy and Titus. Let's go on. And so the majority view of critical New Testament scholars like myself, i.e. not fundamentalists, is that there are two groups of pseudonymous letters in the New Testament, in the Pauline corpus. Hebrews is anonymous rather than pseudonymous. And the three Deutero-Pauline letters are Colossians, Ephesians, and 2 Thessalonians. And then the three pastoral letters are 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. So that is not a unanimous view, but that is certainly the majority view. In the case of Colossians, it may only be a very bare majority of people that think that Paul didn't write Colossians, and it probably is only a bare majority of people who think that Paul didn't write 2 Thessalonians. But there's more of the idea that Paul didn't write Ephesians. And then there is still more of the idea that Paul didn't write the pastorals. So people like me who study the Pauline corpus and who write articles and books and who teach, we are very familiar with the arguments for and against pseudonymity. Let's go on. The minority view, which I don't hold, but the minority view is that Paul has not really been thought to have written Hebrews by any major or mainstream biblical scholar for a long time. Really, nobody particularly respectable since the Second Vatican Council. However, conservative scholars, or more conservative scholars than I, argue that he did write all the other 13 letters of the Pauline corpus. They would say Colossians and Ephesians, as well as 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, had to have been written at a later time during Paul's life. And the fact that their vocabulary is so different can be accounted for in different ways. They usually believe that Paul encountered and was incarcerated a second time in Rome. And of course, if you believe that, then you're believing something that the Acts of the Apostles is quite silent about. And traditionally, conservative scholars tend to think that the Acts of the Apostles was really right about most everything, and the writer of Acts was Luke, and Luke was a protege of Paul and a traveling companion of Paul. And so I don't believe any of those things, but nonetheless, if you do believe that Paul wrote these other letters, Colossians, Ephesians, and the pastorals, you probably do need to confect a second Roman imprisonment. And there are other scholars who propose a mediating solution between actual Pauline authorship and pseudonymity, such as Eduard Schweitzer on Colossians. And Schweitzer, who taught in Switzerland, argued that Paul sort of told the amanuensis, okay, here's what I want to say, and so you write it out. And so you have to decide whether you think that really means Pauline authorship or not. And a lot of people, or a number of people, are very happy with that view of Colossians. My teacher, Robert Jewett, agreed with that, and others do too. And although I think that that skirts the issue of frank pseudonymity. We can go on now. There is a majority view of the pastorals, including the father of modern Pauline studies, Ferdinand Christian Bauer in Tübingen, including the great Heinrich Julius Holtzmann, who was in Heidelberg and ended up in Strasbourg, Martin Debelius, who taught in Heidelberg. Burton Scott Easton was one of the first, if not the first, American to write a commentary on the pastorals, saying that Paul didn't write them. And he taught at Western Theological Seminary in Chicago before the merger to form Seabury Western. And then he later went to New York City, where he taught at General. Hans Conzelmann taught at the University of Göttingen. He was a student of Bultmann. Norbert Brox, a Roman Catholic scholar, taught in Regensburg in South Germany. Robert Karras, a Franciscan priest, taught at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. I certainly have met him. J. Leslie Holden taught at King's London. A.T. Hansen taught at University of Hull. Jimmy Dunn taught he was the Lightfoot Professor of Divinity at Durham. Raymond Collins taught for 25 years at the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, and then he was brought back to the United States to be Dean of Religious Studies at Catholic University in Washington. And most other New Testament scholars believe that Paul didn't write the pastorals. Let's go on to the next view, and that's the minority view. Czeslaw Speake wrote a big, thick commentary on the pastorals. In the Etudes Bibliques series, Joachim Jeremias taught in Göttingen alongside Hans Conzelmann. Reportedly, you couldn't study with both of them. J.N.D. Kelly taught at Oxford and wrote a book called Early Christian Doctrines. Andreas Kirstenberger teaches at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. William Mounce taught at Gordon Conwell and wrote his brilliant grammar book, Basics of Biblical Greek. Luke Timothy Johnson teaches at Candler School of Theology at Emory. And then George Knight teaches in a seminary in South Carolina. And then Philip Towner was very much involved in the American Bible Society and is also one of the priests at St. Ignatius Episcopal Church in New York City, but has worked for the Bible societies for a long time. So you can see that there are very respectable people on both sides of the issue. Let's go on to the next. Conservative scholars usually have problems with New Testament writers using pseudonymity. They believe that pseudonymity is forgery. For that matter, Bart Ehrman believes that too. And they cannot fathom, conservative scholars just can't wrap their minds around early Christian writers doing anything like that. They are moved by the moral argument against pseudonymity. And conservative scholars generally want Paul to have written all the letters in the New Testament which bear his name in the epistolary prescript. And this would mean 13 out of the 14 letters of the Pauline corpus. And so for conservative scholars, especially very conservative scholars, the only exception to Pauline authorship in the Pauline corpus would be Hebrews, which is actually anonymous. Let's go on. I'm a moderate to liberal scholar. There are people out there, I think a lot of my friends think I'm very, very conservative. And then there are other people who think that I'm just unbelievably liberal. But nonetheless, call me a moderate, I guess. I would rather examine Pauline authorship of all the letters in the Pauline corpus on a case-by-case basis. And I want to use literary, form critical, and rhetorical critical, as well as other historical methods, historical correlation. And personally, I would rather bracket the question of whether or not early Christian writers should have used pseudonymity, because I'm in favor of trying to determine if it is more historically likely that they did use pseudonymity. So as a historical critic, a dyed-in-the-wool, unrepentant, unreconstructed historical critic, I want to know what Paul did. And I can only know that by examining the evidence. And therefore, I want to determine the historical likelihood that Paul wrote the letter or that Paul didn't write the letter. And I think it's important that scholars do that. Let's go on. In other words, I am preferring historical methods of analyzing biblical texts rather than methods based on a particular doctrine. By the way, historical criticism used to be called higher criticism, and textual criticism used to be called lower criticism. And you could also do lower criticism. It could also include the study of grammar. It was okay for conservative scholars to do text criticism because you could actually look at manuscripts and then you could actually examine the grammar. And that was lower criticism. And then in fundamentalist circles, that was okay. Let's go on. So lower criticism tries to determine the original text of the Bible based on manuscripts or based on patristic quotes. And we now use the term text criticism or textual criticism. And higher criticism tries to determine why the text is the way it is. It tries to discover what is behind the text in order to explain what the text is really about and what the text even says. Fundamentalists generally think lower criticism is okay, except for the King James only people who are deeply against textual criticism, or at least respectable text criticism. And of course, King James only people are deeply against higher criticism in all its forms. Let's go on. And so one position that was taken very seriously, especially by British scholars, was the fragments hypothesis of P. N. Harrison. And so that book from 1921 argued that there were fragments of authentic Pauline letters embedded in the pastoral epistles. And this theory is not really held by many people today, not least because of the problem that different scholars identify different passages in the pastorals as authentic Pauline fragments. And so the identification of authentic Pauline fragments within the pastorals seems to me to be rather too highly subjective. And so I don't buy the fragments hypothesis myself, but some do. Let's go on. The question that bugs a lot of people, but doesn't bug me, is whether or not Pauline authorship is actually a theological problem. Some scholars believe that it's important to know who the author was in order to fully evaluate the letters, and that would include me. If Paul wrote them, then these letters do indeed speak with Paul's authority. And if Paul did not write the letters, then logically speaking, you have to interpret those letters in a different way. And so my view as a practicing Christian and as a priest is that no matter who wrote these 3 letters, they are still part of the canon of the New Testament. They come to us from the early church, and they are therefore understood to be inspired in the same way as other New Testament writings are understood to be inspired. And yet, when you hold that these letters are inspired, that does not actually solve the difficult exegetical problems of how we should historically interpret these letters. So just because you have a certain theory of inspiration, then the exegetical problems are still with us. Let's go on. One thing is certain. If you or I believe that Paul wrote all the 13 letters of the Pauline corpus that bear his name, or that he wrote only 7 of them, this decision changes your view of Paul. There is a problem of consistency. If Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 and wrote Romans 8, and for that matter wrote 1 Corinthians 15, which is deep, all 3 are deeply eschatological. And then if Paul then also wrote Colossians and Ephesians, I have no way of figuring out what Paul's theology of the second coming of Christ is. In other words, the question that I ask and that my teacher, Richard Parvo, asked when I was in seminary over 40 years ago, the more letters that you admit into your database as having been written by Paul, the question is, do you achieve a more clear view of Paul's theology, history, or practice, or do you achieve a less clear view of Paul's theology, history, or practice? And my teacher in seminary and I believe that it's a less clear view because of the problem of you have a completely different view of eschatology in 1 Thessalonians, Romans, 1 Corinthians on the one hand, and Colossians and Ephesians on the other, especially Colossians. So you then will not, you really will not have a consistent view of Paul's eschatology if you do that. Let's go on. In the pastoral epistles, the biggest difference between these letters and the undisputed letters, undisputed is the more politically correct term, by the way. Normally, I used to call them the authentic letters. But anyway, if in Paul's undisputed or authentic letters, the pattern of leadership is that churches were founded by apostles. And apostles are traveling missionaries and church planters and evangelists. Apostles had ministries in multiple churches. And when Paul was absent from churches, particularly Corinth, the church in Corinth, these churches fell into problems. And so the absence of apostles in the churches that they founded, was very problematic. And then in Corinth, of course, after Paul was there, the only other apostle we know about is Apollos, who was there, who was Paul's rival in Corinth. And there were also in Paul's authentic letters evangelists. There is the term pastor and teacher, which does look like those two titles are paired. as well as others who did ministries. And then there is the term diakonos, which is translated as, should be translated in Paul's letters as minister, because a diakonos actually includes apostles like Paul and Apollos in 1 Corinthians 3:5. And in Philippians 1:1, you have multiple episcopoi as well as diakonoi. Let's go on. And then in the pastoral epistles, you don't have apostoloi anymore. They're presumably dead, and you have one episkopos per church. And so the structure of ministries in Paul's authentic letters is sometimes called a charismatic structure of ministry based on spiritual gifts, which you find in the Pauline letters of undisputed authority. And then in the pastoral letters, presumably after Paul has died, this charismatic structure of the church based on spiritual gifts and based on the presence of apostles here and there, this has been replaced in 1 Timothy and Titus by a different structure, which was hierarchical. And each congregation, as far as we can tell, is headed by a single episkopos, which means an overseer, an administrator, and that's the term that we translate as bishop. And episcopoi do not travel around planting churches or correcting churches or evangelizing. An episkopos stays put in the single congregation in a city. He is the senior pastor of the church in a particular city. And then the episkopos is assisted by presbyteroi and diakonoi, and in 1 Timothy also widows. There is some exegetical question about whether the episkopos is actually the same as or the most senior of the presbyteroi, or is the episcopos actually a separate ministry? But I think in 1 Timothy and Titus, the episcopos is treated as a separate type of ministry. And given that there's one per church and multiple presbyteroi per church, I am convinced that the episcopos is the person really in charge among the Christians in a city. Let's go on. If you believe that Paul wrote 1 Timothy and Titus in order to be historically consistent, you would need to believe that Paul changed his mind about the structure of ministries in the church from the time he wrote the Corinthian letters to the time that, as you may believe, that he wrote 1 Timothy and Titus. But if Paul changed his mind in this way, can anyone really explain his reasons for doing this? What were the historical and organizational factors that are believed to have caused this change? Some people would question whether you can really date the monarchical episcopate, as it is called, as far back as before Paul's death in 62 CE. And I don't believe that you can, but some people don't like the idea of there being a monarchical episcopate presupposed in the pastoral epistles of First Timothy and Titus, although I do in fact see that. And I see it in 1 Timothy and Titus, and of course I see it in the letters of Ignatius of Antioch as well. Let's go on. There are arguments against Pauline authorship that I agree with. And one of the traditional arguments against Pauline authorship of the Deutero-Pauline and pastoral letters has been the differences in vocabulary. A hapax legomenon is a word only used once. And there are a higher number of Greek words used only once in the New Testament and in the pastoral epistles, and not in the undisputed Pauline letters. Of the approximately 850 Greek words used in the pastorals, excluding proper names, about 1/3 of them do not appear in the Pauline letters of undisputed authorship. and therefore this is a high percentage of hapax legomena. There are also more hapax legomena in Ephesians and Colossians. Let's go on. Certain terms which are frequently used in Paul and which have very particular meanings are either not used in the pastorals or have different meanings in the pastorals. I would certainly argue that diakonos is a general term for a minister in the Undisputed Letters, and it means a subordinate minister in the pastorals. Raymond Collins, the distinguished New Testament scholar, points out that body is not found in the pastorals at all, and that Lord, Paul's preferred term for Christ, is not used in the striking way Paul does. The words righteousness and the phrase in Christ are used in ways which are different from the way Paul uses them. And he has made a good argument for that in page 3 of his New Testament library, very fine commentary on 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Let's go on. It's notable, very notable, that, the most important manuscript of the New Testament is Codex Vaticanus B, otherwise known as 03, and also the earliest manuscript of the Pauline corpus does not include any of the pastoral epistles. In other words, neither Codex Vaticanus or P46, neither Codex B nor P46 include the pastoral epistles. Codex Vaticanus is perhaps the most valuable and complete of all New Testament manuscripts, dating from the 4th century, and P46 is the earliest manuscript of the Pauline corpus, and it is usually dated in the year 200 CE. These are extremely significant omissions from the earliest manuscript tradition of Pauline letters. They suggest that by the end of the 4th century, if not by the end of the 2nd century, at least in these codices, these letters were not thought to be part of Holy Scripture, or had not been, the person copying it did not have a copy of the pastoral epistles. So it either wasn't available or wasn't thought to be by Paul, wasn't thought to be the New Testament. So those are important omissions. Let's go on. The earliest quotations quotes the authentic Pauline letters plus Hebrews, and does not quote any of the pastoral epistles. This is a very notable omission, because what was written in 1 Timothy and Titus about church order and the role and the authority of the Episcopos in 1 Timothy and Titus would have strengthened the case of the Bishop of Rome against the Corinthian church. And the Corinthian church had thrown out their clergy. And so it's this is an argument from silence, but in this case, this argument from silence may be very eloquent, because this is exactly the kind of thing that you would have expected that First Clement would have used in order to write to the church in Corinth. First Clement also didn't have or copy or didn't use 2 Corinthians, which also would have been stating against the Corinthian opponents. Anyway, so I think the lack of those quotations in First Clement is an important argument against Pauline authorship. Let's go on. And so Philip Towner tries to make a case to place 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy and Titus within the Pauline orbit. He acknowledges that the problems raised are both on the literary and historical levels. And I do think that I am understanding that he does think that Paul wrote these letters. And the real question is whether you can make a good case for it. Let's go on to the next one. Dr. A.T. Hansen, who originally held the fragments hypothesis, P. N. Harrison, he maintained the view that there were authentic Pauline fragments in his little commentary on the pastorals in 1966, but he subsequently came to abandon it in his commentary in the New Century Bible in 1982. And he says, it looks as if the fragments hypothesis was a last desperate attempt to retain some Pauline element in the pastorals. And so he goes on to say in another paragraph, the pastorals have no authentically Pauline elements in them at all. They are wholly pseudonymous and were composed by a writer subsequent to Paul's day who wished to claim Paul's authority for his material. So there was a really good, very much of a mainstream New Testament scholar who taught at the University of Hull for many years. Let's go on. Well, Robert Wall wrote the commentary in the Two Horizons series. And of course, that takes off from Anthony Thiselton's important book, The Two Horizons, New Testament Scholarship and Philosophical Description. And so certainly Thiselton and certainly Wall are very interested in hermeneutics. And so he does, however, say that the attribution of the pastoral epistles to Paul, even though he uses the term Paul, he says such an attribution is not secured by historical analysis, since the hard evidence necessary to do so is much too sparse and uncertain. So I think he's pretty frank about that. But of course, if you're saying the evidence is sparse and uncertain, why bother to say it's Paul? But I think he's very interested in the hermeneutic and the fact that Paul's letters are part of the canon of the New Testament and are authoritative in the church. So I think he probably prefers to refer to the author of the pastorals as Paul, perhaps for that reason. So he's more interested in, theology. And myself, I'm more interested in historical and literary issues and rhetorical issues. So let's go on to the next. Father Collins, in his commentary, which was the lead-off volume in the New Testament library when they started making commentaries, the arguments against Pauline authorship of the pastoral epistles that have been advanced and refined during the past 2 centuries cumulatively raise serious doubts about the authenticity of these texts. Considerations of style and vocabulary, of content and theology, of incipient church order, and of consistency within the Pauline profile established by the undisputed letters and the data supplied by Acts establish the inauthenticity of these texts beyond all reasonable doubt. Now, there's a forthright statement. So let's go on. There are other statements. Luke Timothy Johnson, in his commentary on 1st and 2nd Timothy in the Anchor Bible, he says, I insert emphatically the impossibility of demonstrating the authenticity of the pastoral letters. However, it is possible to state that the grounds for declaring them inauthentic are so flawed as to seriously diminish the validity of the scholarly majority of opinion. Then if you can't know that Paul wrote it and you can't know that Paul didn't write them, okay, where do you go from there? I don't know. But let's go on. Why I favor pseudonymity is the vocabulary is different. You have a considerably higher number of hapax legomena. You have the lack of attestation by the church fathers. You have the lack of the manuscript evidence for them in the Codex Vaticanus and P46. You have the massive shift in church organization. You have the differences in theology from the undisputed letters of Paul. And then the fact is that doubts about the authorship of the pastorals go back to the early days of modern biblical studies, and they have been expressed by very respectable New Testament scholars. And so these doubts about the authorship of the pastorals certainly persist in contemporary New Testament scholarship, which is to say, we're not unanimous on it, but the majority view is that Paul didn't write them. Nonetheless, we all agree that the pastoral epistles have something to do with Pauline churches after the, in a very late Pauline period. And in my view, that includes after the death of Paul. So they have something to do with Paul. And the question is whether the evidence really shows that they are likely to be written or dictated by Paul. And so I share the doubts. And so in this case, I'm a mainstream New Testament scholar. And so we can go to the next. And so in my view, the way forward, if you really don't know, is, if you're not sure, proceed and start reading these letters with an open mind, if that is actually possible, meaning that we definitely do not know whether Paul wrote them or not. And you can only try to evaluate the probability or improbability of Pauline authorship. You cannot really evaluate certainty. You can only evaluate probability versus improbability. And whether or not Paul wrote the pastoral epistles, they are nonetheless Holy Scripture, and they are early Christian literature, and they deserve our best efforts at trying to understand them. They are first or early second century documents written by Paul or other Christians in the Pauline tradition or in some Pauline tradition, and they were trying to guide the early church. And so in my view, that makes the pastoral letters very important, whether or not you think Paul wrote them. And I think that could be the last slide.
It is. All the other slides after are blank.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, well, I've said too much.
Oh, no, I don't think you said too much. And I have the link to purchase Frank's book in the description below. The Corinthian Correspondence is what it's called. He co-authored it with the late Bob Jewett. And I'll have the link to the Rustin and Redeemer YouTube channel that posts videos of Frank on there. It'll be tagged in the description below. And I also have the link to purchase the book in the pinned comment as well, which is below the description. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Frank Hughes.
You're very welcome. And the storm seems to have passed, so I think that's okay. So I'll see you another time.
Yep. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.